right. Nice to be here with you. Thanks for attending my talk. I wanted to just introduce you to the idea behind this presentation. I think that there are odd things that are done in software development, and oftentimes we might wonder who is odd. Is it the way that things are done commonly? Is that the odd way? Or is maybe those who practice domain-driven design the odd way of developing software? And then we'll talk about reaching an end, something that we can all achieve if we're mindful about the development that we're doing. So as Sean mentioned, I am the author of Implementing Domain-Driven Design, and I also teach a workshop. It's a 3-day workshop on implementing domain-driven design. I'll be in Berlin next week. I have some other upcoming events, one in Denver, Vancouver, Canada, and New York City in April. What I find in talking to just about every software development team, whether it's a client or those who just meet me at a meetup or something like that, is that software projects are in peril. It's an interesting situation because you'll find software development projects that have a team of developers that are dedicated to keeping the software alive. They're literally patching the system day after day and dealing with emergencies. And from what I can tell, almost every company, every organization is dealing with this kind of situation. How many of you here are experiencing that kind of situation? Yeah, so a lot of you are know what I'm talking about. You'll have teams of guys like this, maybe the uber geeks, and they're all just trying to keep things running. So this is obviously not a situation that we want to be stuck in. How do we deal with actually alleviating ourselves of these kinds of problems? Well, what I'm going to talk about first are maybe the odd things that we experience in software development. And you know what, I have to tell you, I woke up at 2:30 in the morning last night sweating over this slide, and I realized, uh-oh, the code of conduct. So I don't want to make fun of these children, even though they aren't wearing either an Apple Watch or a Fitbit. So you might wonder, what are the odd things that happen in software development? I think that this is one of the most insidious problems, where an IT department as a whole or a software development organization within a company is considered a cost center. This is where the business views software development as something that merely costs them money. They have to tolerate software developers. They almost wish that they didn't have to use them, but these computers keep getting in their way, and so they have to use software developers. But software development in general is viewed as a negative. It is a drain on the organization. And when that happens, it causes other problems. For example, budgets for software developers are minimal. So oftentimes you'll have a situation where there will be one very senior developer and a lot of immature developers on the project, and the one senior developer is supposed to keep everything working as smoothly as possible, but the company is really not investing in software. They don't consider software to be a game changer for them simply something that they have to tolerate. So this is a big problem. And so the question is, how does the company view you? How does the business view you? Do they view you as a hacker, as someone who is just thrilled with technology, where you're always trying to solve business problems by throwing technology at it? If that's the case, then you may be viewed as a cost to the organization rather than a profit center. So this could be a problem, how the company views you. How will you change that? How will you change the view that the company has of you? Another insidious problem is constantly looking at the business as a database. Recently on a project, the organization was using, let's take for instance MySQL. They were using a relational database in their legacy system. And let's say that we switched in a new service or a new project to using MongoDB. Let's just take those two databases for example. There were clear distinctions in the names of the software that was running in both of those projects, the legacy system and in the new system. In fact, we were using a DDD bounded context, and so the bounded context had a name. But those that were working around the project had a very difficult time referring to either of those projects in context. What they actually said was, MySQL does this and MongoDB does that. Let's write something to translate from MySQL to MongoDB. Their language was completely centered on the database technology in use. In my opinion, the database technology in use on a new system could have been of several different varieties. We simply happen to be using, for example, MongoDB. In fact, the use of MongoDB in this case happened to be not even the best choice, in my opinion. And so we have to really be careful about having our thoughts so focused on the technologies that we can't even refer to the projects by their logical names or even product names. Another problem in software development is when developers are always chasing the shiny objects. And this could be database, for example. But even TDD, BDD, DDD, these could all be things that are viewed as shiny objects to the organization. So how do we justify the use of various practices, such as domain-driven design? And when we're talking about shiny objects, some of the latest shiny objects are yesterday's has-beens, actually. Think about big data. Big data was a big buzzword 5 or 6 years ago. And it's continued to be a buzzword, but more lately, if you're not using the term machine learning, you're uncool, right? If you're not saying artificial intelligence or deep learning, you're nowhere. Big data is in the past now. So are we constantly chasing shiny objects, or are we using technology where it's appropriate? What will be the next shiny object? I don't know. We don't know exactly, but there will be shiny objects out there. So we'll have to think later about how we can change our mindset from chasing certain technologies as shiny objects and doing more valuable things. Here's another insidious problem, a quote from a project that I worked on recently. It doesn't matter what you name it, it's just code. Well, for everybody here, you should really care about what you name it. what you name a certain concept on the project, what you name your methods in an object-oriented project, what you name the classes. All of these things really matter, and for the common developer, it's actually very true that they think in this way, and they immediately create a translation between themselves and the business. So the business wants to talk about it in this way, but the developer says, it's just code, we'll call it this. It doesn't really matter. That's another big problem. I hate to say it, folks, but Jira could be one of the worst tools ever invented. I mean, why would a business person want to sit in their office or cubicle for days on end writing specifications when we could have a 1-hour conversation and come up with a really solid design that backs what the business wants to do? And yet, business people will spend days in their cubicle or office working with Jira, writing specifications. And you know what? Most of the developers don't use it. It really doesn't matter what they write, because it's not generally what the developers need to know, other than the length of fields in the database or something like that. But these specifications that get stored in Jira just lead to poor collaboration. That's what it amounts to. Estimates are a huge problem. How many times do you spend longer estimating the problem than it would take to actually solve the problem? Estimates are a big deal, and a lot of us face difficulties in trying to come up with estimates. How could we find a way to make estimates work better for us? What about design itself, software design? This is a technique that I call the task board shuffle. It's where software design is entirely comprised of moving a sticky note from the to-do column into the in-progress column. Design is done. Now we all run back to our machines and we start coding. And there's some miracle that takes place, because without design, or thoughtful design, I should say, the code comes out from our fingertips, and if you have 5 different programmers working on the project, there are 5 different translations that occur on one single day of the business solution or the business problem at hand. So this is an insidious problem where thoughtful design does not take place. The thing is that a lot of people think that no design is a form of code economy or development economy. It is not development economy, because design takes place as thoughts are flowing through your brain to your fingertips into the code. It's just that you're not doing good design. So avoid the task board shuffle. Big ball of mud. There was never a more appropriate name for this kind of software, and so many organizations are producing this kind of software, to the point where microservices has become a really big deal in the industry. Somehow people imagine that even though they can't build a worthy monolith, somehow they're going to make thousands of services work together cohesively. But maybe that isn't actually a good solution either. So we have to recognize when we're getting into a situation where a big ball of mud is being developed, how do we stay out of that situation? Well, our models often start out small, like this. They're manageable, but before you know it, this is what our systems look like. We have many tangled models that should actually be separate, and yet They're all in one place, perhaps even under the same module or package or namespace, and this causes huge problems in the industry. I see very often business logic in persistence. So someone is ready to save an object to storage of some kind, persistent storage, and there is business logic actually interwoven right into the persistence logic. This obviously means that the persistent logic is hiding very important business logic, and we've now lost an important traceability to where our business logic resides. There are also queries that have business logic in them. And when queries have business logic, again, this is hiding the details of what is most important to the business. Broken queries. Broken queries are a big deal because, especially when you're using an object relational kind of technology or a relational database, you can have blockers basically where the join queries are so complex that it causes table locks, row locks, and so forth on the database that prevents other queries from running. And sometimes your queries are so expensive that it can literally shut down other business operations while those lengthy queries are running. Business logic in the user interface. This is a really big problem. It's just basically that the domain model is not being used to house business logic. Business logic is escaping into the user interface, is escaping into the database, into database queries, and so forth. CRUD and Anemic domain model. Actually, CRUD can be a very good solution in some cases, but when you have complexity, CRUD does not work. CRUD is an insidious problem when software development team thinks that they can solve every problem with a database. And then you take on all the responsibility, all the overhead of developing a domain model, but because the domain model is anemic, a lot of the logic that, or a lot of the overhead that you incur for developing a domain model is wasted because you don't get any of the normal benefits of developing a domain model. How many of you find wrong abstractions in your projects? Yeah, about the same as the other question that I asked. Wrong abstractions are very insidious because a lot of times software developers, instead of just getting down to the business and what the business wants to see, will form really cool abstractions that will take care of many broad problems in the future. Because the software development team will say, well, what if we have this sort of situation in the future? How will we deal with that situation? They say, well, if we come up with this idea, this kind of abstraction, then this kind of abstraction will take care of that situation that may occur in the future. Just like with the stock market, we can't predict the future. And the future of software is quite a bit an unknown. And so trying to solve problems that may happen and coming up with abstractions that could take care of problems that may happen really don't work very well for us. Tightly coupled services. And what I mean by this in particular is when a service is used by some user and they accomplish something in the service. Now let's just say that the service is handled by a controller, by a REST controller or something like that, and that controller carries out some business action. So we have the user interface carrying out the business logic in this controller, and then that controller makes a REST request based on something that occurred in your own system and calls across to another RESTful system to accomplish something else. That is a tight coupling. And there's a big problem there, not only in the coupling itself, but in the dependency of the other system running at the time that it needs to happen. And so what happens in this case? Well, it's why we have those teams of people that patch data and patch systems all the time. Because while the request completes in the original target system, the system that target system is dependent on may not be running, or there may be some other kind of problem that occurs, and the total global transaction, even though you're not using XA or global transactions, doesn't fully commit, and so you have a gap in your business logic where data is out of consistency on two different systems. So this is a big problem that is faced. The question is really, what do we do about these kinds of problems? And like I alluded to in my introduction, it really could be that everybody else is normal. That writing systems in the way that I just described is what is actually the norm. However, if that is normal, wouldn't you like to be the oddball in the crowd? I do. And if we as DDDers are the oddballs, that's fine with me. I would like to be much different than that. So let's see what we can do to correct this situation. The ends part of my talk has to do with the second definition of the word end. We want to be at the furthest, most extreme point away from these kinds of problems. We want to be at the very end, far away from them, and coming up with the solutions that really work for us. So we have to rise above this. We have to raise the level of security or of maturity in teams. Raising the level of maturity means that your business must not view you as just a technologist, but they must view you as someone who is interested in the business. If you're going to, in essence, walk tall within the business, you're going to have to be interested in the business and helping the business achieve greatness by the work that you do, which means that you can't just keep throwing technology at the problems. You actually have to come up with beneficial business solutions, solutions that promote the business further. So we have to develop, we have to maintain a good cadence in moving forward with developer maturity. It may be that if your organization views you as a cost center, that you may have to come by ways of making your advances more economical. Perhaps there's nothing in the budget that allows for your entire team to attend this conference. Perhaps your entire team should be here at this conference. But if they can't, then you're going to have to seek other ways to bring the rest of your team up to maturity. But it is our responsibility to help the community of developers that we work with to find maturity. Urge them to go to DDD meetups. Urge them to go to software craftsmanship meetups, free events, things that are available online for free. Do whatever you can, because you can only benefit if those around you are more mature developers next year than they were this year. So this requires education. It also requires passion, and passion is something that unfortunately we can't always teach. Sometimes we can motivate people into a passionate view of their jobs, but if we can't, then maybe it's just time to find someone else to work with who can be passionate about their job. What we want to do is allow the business to recognize us as a profit center, not as a cost center. Now, some organizations may never actually come around to this conclusion that a software development team or organization as a whole, a department or an entire unit of the business is a profit center. If you can't do anything to make a change of that viewpoint, it may be time to find a company that recognizes that it is a software company and not just a business that uses computers. And I think that Carlo made a reference, or someone did this morning, to a paper by Michael Feathers recently. I would suggest reading that because Michael Feathers asserts that companies that are in technology or that heavily use technology have to recognize themselves as a software company. If they do not recognize themselves as a software company and they are heavily reliant on software, they are most likely doomed as a business because software is eating the world. Read that paper. It's very interesting. I'm interested in seeing what his further developments are in that area. Get Jira out of the way. Collaborate with the business. Form a team. The message that Cyril gave this morning about collaboration, about using a ubiquitous language, it really works. When you can get someone away from their desk and into a room to talk about the model, you will be amazed at what you'll learn. You may find that the business has been referring to certain very core concepts for years in ways that they absolutely detest. They hate calling it X. They call it X because who knows why? Nobody can even explain why. The history is completely covered. Even tribal knowledge can't explain why we call it this. Could we please just call it this instead? And you can learn those very interesting, very beneficial details by going over and forming a ubiquitous language with the business. So make it your goal to find out what is the ubiquitous language within a bounded context. In order to do that well, you have to use concrete scenarios. Scenarios that show real users using the system in certain ways and what that is supposed to achieve. Again, Cyril's talk this morning introduced you to a lot of those ideas. What are the shiny objects that we as developers should be chasing after? We should be chasing after deep models. Those are the shiny objects that will move a business to greatness. It's not just technologies. And as Eric said yesterday, we must use technology. Obviously, technology matters. And the kind of technology we use matters. But try to experience the development of deep models through a ubiquitous language. This is the shiny object we should focus on. Use DDD bounded contexts. Instead of the big ball of mud, notice that there are actually 6 different bounded contexts that come out of this big ball of mud. If we were to have modeled what resulted, or the results of the big ball of mud using domain-driven design, we would actually have 6 different bounded contexts. The one in the foreground is the core domain, but we would have 5 other supporting or generic subdomains involved. It's equally as important to separate the models as it is to get the right concepts into the core domain. Our friend Alberto has introduced us to event storming, and this is extremely useful and important. Go get Alberto's book. If you haven't gotten it today, go download it during lunch. Soon, very soon. You have to learn about event storming. And this is actually an exercise, as Alberto described yesterday, where you can understand what your bounded contexts are from an event storming session. Perhaps you use 2 or 4 hours a day. Perhaps you divide that up into 3 different sessions over 3 days. You sleep on your work. Within 2 or 3 days, you can have a very, very great wealth of information at your disposal to form your ubiquitous language and understand where your context boundaries are. And this is what else I want to show you about this, and I don't know how much Alberto has spoken about this, but what you can do with the artifacts that come out of an event storming session is use those as estimation units. You actually have a lot of detail that comes from the event storming sessions, and I have seen this used and have used this technique to actually attach metrics and use a metrics-based estimation process that will get you within most likely 5 to 20% of the real number that it will take. And the shorter length of time of your iterations, as in 2 weeks, you will probably get within, exact to 5 or 10% of the time frame that you estimate. If you can't finish an iteration according to what you had planned because you run out of time in your time box, then move these estimation units in a retrospective and incur modeling debt. This may be a term that you have not heard before, but you can incur modeling debt in a DDD project because you want to go back and address that debt as soon as you possibly can. If you haven't achieved all of the knowledge acquisition that you wanted to achieve in a specific iteration. So your task board will look like this. You'll have fine-grained components in the task list that have estimation units on them, and the estimation units include time for design. Even above and beyond the event storming sessions that you have, you will still probably need to go through some scenarios, some concrete scenarios. You may use behavior-driven design or development, I should say, or unit tests or something like that to create acceptance tests around the scenarios that you develop. But this is not the task board shuffle. This actually includes time that is set aside for more careful design of each of the components. In order to avoid the problems of putting business logic where it doesn't belong, you have to understand architecture. You have to know what your architecture is and how you need to adhere to the architecture. For example, business logic should go at the heart of this architecture. It should be in the domain model. The application services that surround it should take care of security and transactions. Perhaps you have security at the outer edges of this architecture also. But you do not want business logic in your UI, and you do not want business logic in your repository adapters. You don't want business logic in your messaging mechanism. All of your business logic should be at the heart of your software. Use command query responsibility segregation for queries. Have a separate query model. This will allow you to redesign heavyweight queries in such a way that you may not even have to use joins. In fact, it should be a goal not to use joins. Therefore, you will have the most efficient queries going to the database and bringing back information in queries, and not have broken queries, not have queries that block other queries from running. It's very important. Use proper abstractions. Recently, in a project, there was a team who had designed an elaborate forms processing system. Why? Because they had 4 forms that they needed to fill out or have their customers fill out, and they thought that there might be a 5th or 6th form in the future. And so they developed an elaborate abstraction for forms processing that was many, many thousands of lines of code more than was actually needed if they would have just developed the proper abstractions that represented the forms, the 4 forms that they needed. I mean, it's incredible how much code economy there was when the proper abstractions were actually used in a new bounded context that was developed. Services should be decoupled. So the service that I described, where a user makes a request, a RESTful request into the system, and that RESTful request is carried out, and then another RESTful request is made to a peer service, but that fails. The way that you can solve this problem is with the use of domain events. The first service that the request comes in on, after or when that request is carried out, a domain event gets published. The domain event is saved persistently and is then put into a messaging mechanism that at some point in time will be delivered to all interested parties, perhaps another service. This is a way not only to decouple your systems, but to guarantee that what you intended for that peer service to carry out will actually get completely carried out at some point in the future, and generally speaking, in a relatively very short period of time, maybe just a few seconds or less. Okay, what I wanted to do just for a few minutes is talk about using microservices, and this is a very hot topic. It's another shiny object maybe that people are chasing, but I want to make it clear that according to some sources, microservices are an extremely, are actually very, very similar to what in domain-driven design we call a bounded context. So look at Sam Newman's book, Building Microservices. He references Eric's book, he references my book there. And what he is recommending is creating microservices in the size of a DDD bounded context. It was funny that yesterday Alberto was drawing on the DDD timeline upstairs, and he said, now we can deploy single letters of the alphabet. And that's sometimes what microservices are seen as being, but I think that that's the wrong level of deployment, or at least you may have very good reasons for deploying at a single component level. That's up to you, but I think that microservices developed as DDD bounded context is a very powerful approach. And you may have noticed that my modeling elements in this case have changed from rectangles to circles. That's because what I'm representing here are actors. I think that the actor model is an extremely powerful and essential, vital tool that will need to be used in the very near future, possibly by the majority of software development teams, because processor power is not increasing, but the number of cores in machines and the amount of memory in machines is increasing. And the actor model is a very powerful way to leverage the new kinds of power that we do have in servers and commodity hardware, so that threads are being used to run what absolutely needs to be run right now and are not blocking, waiting on I/O and other things. So what I recommend is using microservices with DDD bounded context as is described in this book, and this is one of the books that I'm going to give away. This is my latest to be published book, Reactive Messaging Patterns with the Actor Model. So give some serious consideration and read about this. And I like to call this the simplicity stack, where much of enterprise software today really resembles a complexity stack where there's so many mechanisms involved that it takes months and months for even a senior developer to learn everything that they need to noodle about an architecture of a single system. The actor model can make your systems much simpler. It can be as simple as having a UI controller that delegates directly to the domain model, and you have an asynchronous actor represented here, or representative of a book order, and also your technical event journal, where your event streams are saved, is also an asynchronous component. Again, this puts a focus on modeling in a way that allows the machine to use components in the most optimal way possible. So take a look at that. This is the book, Go Reactive with Reactive Messaging Patterns with the Actor Model. So in summary, teams are in peril because of poor design of systems today. Software development culture is largely broken, and we need to do something about it. Developers must gain maturity, and we have to, as attendees of this conference, carry the message to other developers to create within themselves a software craftsmanship attitude, knowledge, to get the right education. And you can use domain-driven design to make a difference. And possibly you'd like to look into using the actor model to design DDD-based microservices. And a nod to one of our favorite persons, there's just one more thing. What would you think if you could have a resource that would allow you to come up to speed with domain-driven design very quickly? What if you could bring your teams up to speed with domain-driven design in a rapid fashion? What if you had the means to accelerate your projects and manage your DDD projects and even sell DDD to your management? Well, I'm announcing at this conference a new book, Domain-Driven Design Distilled. This book is just ready to enter production. It's about 200 to 250 pages in length, and it should be available for purchase within a month or so. So that's all that I have for today. Any questions? We have about a few minutes.
At the risk of sounding stupid, you mentioned before, avoiding using things like a business logic in your presentation layer. There's an application we're working on at the office, which is really quite complex, particularly in the UI. And I'm wondering how you kind of see that actually being managed. Like, do you have view classes within your domain model that manages that, or how do you see that working?
Boy, I'm having trouble hearing the question. Actually, the echo is quite loud. So, business logic in the user interface. Say again.
Logic, business logic. Do you have that within the domain layer, or where would you use it?
Okay, so if I understand the question, you're saying how do we actually deal with the fact that business logic is that you may need some business logic in the UI? It could be that you may need to view a user interface, certain user interfaces as a separate bounded context. That's a possibility. I wouldn't say that I would jump to that conclusion immediately, but if you truly do have business logic that is very closely associated with like a very rich UI, maybe like Tom Jensen's is developing his 3D design tool. All of his business logic is actually in the client, and he has some he has some logic on a server, or will have, in order to save those models. But most of his business logic is actually written in JavaScript, deployed to the browser. Does that help at all? Okay. Maybe one more question. So this book goes over the essentials of domain-driven design. It introduces teams, individual developers, to the most important DDD design tools, and it moves very rapidly. It's meant to bring people up to speed very quickly, and then they can reference Eric's book or my book or Scott Millett's book for more detail later. But and it even is appropriate for management to use in order to sell your management on why you should use DDD, and to prove to them that you can manage a project and accelerate with a project that uses domain-driven design. Okay, good. So the gentleman is saying, thank you for bringing up microservices, because microservices have been largely not mentioned at the conference, and that he's been a proponent and using of DDD and using DDD for 10 years, and he believes that microservices is potentially one of the biggest accelerators to help promote DDD, and certainly from the standpoint of Sam Newman's book in describing microservices as DDD bounded contexts, I have to agree it's been a big help. So that's one way also to help your organizations understand what is a microservice. It's even called a DDD bounded context. It's interesting that one of my clients recently explained to his management that microservices used to be called DDD bounded contexts, but now they're called microservices. Okay, I didn't write that, he did. But it's interesting, and I agree. Microservices, if developed in the right way, using DDD bounded contexts, can be a huge benefit to organizations. I think that's all the time we have. All right, thank you very much.